Hi everyone, I am Hayley Hughes, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm currently a design director at Nike working on design systems. So recently, I interviewed 10 people who lead design systems at large in-house companies, and their titles were UX manager, senior design manager, program director, senior director of engineering, and even head of design. One reason that I reached out to these people is because recently one of my reports asked me what moving into management is like. And I said that for me it was about letting go of control over some decisions in order to give me more energy in growing people. To me, the most exciting part about management has been those moments when I look back year over year and see the growth of individuals on the team. And I wondered if that's what lights me up. I wonder what inspires other people to move into leadership. There's also a personal reason that I reached out to these people. I know what it's like firsthand to have limitations put on your career because of other people's perception of your role or your capabilities. And that's a really challenging place to be. It can feel lonely and confusing. I think there's a lot of myths that need to be busted about design system leaders and what they're capable of. Here are a few that I've heard in my career. Design system leaders don't make as big of an impact because they only manage one team. They don't understand product thinking and customer experience because they just make the components. They aren't accountable to business results because they're infrastructure people and they're internal overhead. Design system leaders don't have enough experience with cultivating culture because they're the ones making the tools. Design system leaders don't have experience with collaboration because they operate like an ivory tower. If you hear any of these things from recruiters, from people in your org, from other places, I'm here today to offer 6 jobs you can do to actively debunk these myths. Design system teams and these leaders know the organization better than anyone else. And we have to help other people realize this too. I really believe this, not only from my experience, but I heard it many times in these interviews from people who I spoke with who have over 75 years of combined experience in design systems. But before I tell you about their experiences, I'd like to first tell you about my first job answering phones. Hello? You've reached Union Square Cafe. How may I assist you? That still is likely to be what you'd hear at the restaurant today, as you might have heard over a decade ago when I worked there. And why is that? It's because we designed a system for how we respond to every call. There were things that we all said the same way, and then there was opportunities to bring your personality in, except for one thing: no negative language. It seemed like a small detail, avoiding words like no, not, don't, won't, can't, shouldn't, but it was really hard not to say those words on the phone. At first, I thought it wouldn't matter. Some people answering the phones would ignore the system and they'd say the words anyways. But I stuck with it and eventually I got good at it. And surprisingly, people would call back and they would ask for my manager, which made me really nervous. But instead of complaining, they would rave about me or a teammate, even if yes meant referring them to another sister restaurant or finding them a reservation on a different date. We were always there to help. The point is that if you're designing a system, thinking happens at every altitude, big and small. A big idea like, how might we cultivate a culture of hospitality, turns into a principle. Hospitality is about always finding the yes, which turns into a decision. Avoid negative language with guests, which turns into an outcome. Guests rave about the experience. This kind of structure is a good example of how leaders help people define purpose, first principles, and build scaffolding that turns good decisions into great outcomes. Over the years, what we've defined as a design system has changed. At one point, maybe it was a UI kit with some guidelines being used as a reference tool. And then people started coding components, and so design systems became released and delivered like a product. Today, as we saw yesterday, some companies have a system of systems that are maintained by multiple teams. And this has led design systems to become a community of practice, where systems are a platform for scaling decisions and assets across the entire enterprise. There's a lot at stake when decisions get scaled, and that's why we need design systems leadership. Design systems leadership is the practice of enabling people to make good decisions that can be scaled. Without leadership, design systems can become a force multiplier for scaling harmful decisions. And I know this because I've seen it happen at many organizations. For example, I was once mentoring a designer who had designed a website where it took 6 clicks to find the phone number for customer support. And when I asked her why she designed it that way, she said that she had been asked by people more senior than her to make the phone number less obvious on the website. When I asked her why they asked her to do that, she said it was because the business put an incentive system in place that rewarded the support team based on how few calls were coming in. She knew that the phone calls coming in could affect people's safety, but she felt helpless to do anything about it. Having a leader advocating for change and guiding her to challenge the incentive system is the difference between scaling harmful decisions and scaling good ones. So how do people start their design systems leadership journey? People getting started in systems have different backgrounds. A common theme that I heard was being hybrid. This means trying on many hats to grow interdisciplinary skills such as product design, user experience, accessibility, organizational design, ops, and even visual design and front-end development. I heard all of these skills. With diverse experiences comes more understanding and empathy for teammates. There were certain moments in one's career that tend to be the catalyst for a move into design systems. Across the layers of the customer experience stack, leaders described what inspired their interest in systems. Jared at Shopify said that he made the move into systems work because it enabled him to zoom out and look at the user experience more holistically. Lindsay at Lyft described a past life making brand style guides at an agency. And she would hand off quality work that would never seem to get fully adopted. So she decided to move in-house and be the founding designer of a design system. Jules kept asking herself, how can I be designing something if I don't understand how it's built? She pivoted into front-end development and eventually started a design system at Credit Karma. Mirko at IBM had been doing organizational transformation, and he wanted to understand why teams were or weren't shipping products successfully. And this research led him into design systems. My path was also nonlinear. I was working doing graphic design and local food systems, and it turns out that those skills were actually transferable to design systems. Everyone has their own journey, and there's no one path. It's also evident that every layer of the customer experience is impacted by the decisions being made by design system teams. From where we sit, we have this unique vantage point where we can see these relationships between the front and the backstage of the customer experience. When you work on design systems, there are people who assume that they know what you do, but in reality, they have no clue. Here are some examples to prove this. One leader said that when they introduce themselves as working on design systems, the first thing that people think is, oh, you're the component library guy. And whatever actual work I'm trying to do with them is actually clouded by their perception of our components. Another leader said that people come to them believing that they can solve any type of problem. For example, the CEO would come to them with a screenshot of an app that they think is ugly and say, what's going on here? And that person has to point them to the team that can actually fix it. These misunderstandings highlight why a big part of the job is defining what design systems are and what they mean for your company. Here are many ways that leaders define design systems when I asked them. As you can see, they're all different. It doesn't matter if your definition is up here. What matters is that you align with stakeholders on the scope of your team's work and the edges of the system. And this part of the job never ends. So how else do leaders spend their days? Before, maybe you were doing craft work, writing code, giving support, designing the system. And as you grow into management, there's this shift to operational work. You're enabling customers, teams, and the business. Based on my interviews and my own experiences, I think there are 6 jobs that design system leaders need to do well, regardless of their context. Job number 1, leaders need to champion quality. This means ensuring that great customer experiences can be delivered without having to be the person to do it. Leaders describe system teams as shepherds of quality, putting standards in place for how all teams can improve product craft and user experience. These include requirements around things like usability, accessibility, performance, visual design, globalization, artificial intelligence, and ethical design, and establishing programs and practices that help teams meet those requirements. At Dropbox, Lauren's passion for up-leveling craft led her to co-create a new critique practice with asynchronous updates. She said that getting visibility into the work early led to more outbound support rather than waiting for people to come to office hours when the decisions had already been made. Why does this matter? Because without design systems representation at the highest levels championing the customer experience, a business will build a lower quality product slower. Building practices such as gathering these requirements and facilitating critiques is how you drive quality without sacrificing speed. Which brings me to job number 2. Leaders need to manage change. Managing change means enabling people to adopt a new behavior or a new experience with as little friction as possible. It involves creating awareness about a change, training teams on the resources or tools needed to make that change, and engaging customers in feedback in order to learn from it. According to Lindsay, at Lyft, it's hard to manage massive change without upsetting people. Last year, her team undertook a huge brand refresh, and she described what it took to migrate everything over to the new style. On the surface, the change was as easy as flipping a switch and being like, oh, it magically works. But behind the scenes, she got on everyone's roadmap, planned the QA and testing, made sure things weren't breaking, and met with every single team affected by this change, which probably felt like the entire org. As leaders, we have to boil the ocean 1 gallon at a time. Even though design systems can power changes that touch every surface at that 30,000-foot level, the actual work that it takes to manage change happens at the 30-foot level. And as it turns out, leaders spend a lot of time at that altitude. At IBM, their grand vision was to unify all the pattern libraries into one place. But that change wasn't as simple as it sounded. The first question that Mirko got was, what do you mean when you say pattern? This led to research audits, examining all the so-called patterns that existed and looking for commonalities between them. And then there came several debates and eventually a shared definition of patterns and their attributes. Without these smaller decisions, that big idea to bring everything in one place would be impossible. Being thoughtful about the changes that you put in the hands of customers is critical to leadership. Diana said that doing this put her in a position to eventually lead all of design at GitHub because product managers saw that she could handle large rollouts and manage change at scale. Job number 3, we've got to enable people. Enablement means giving someone the power, the tools, or the resources to do something. It involves making things possible for people and helping them reach their full potential. One way that we do this is through coaching. In the context of design systems, coaching guides individuals or groups of people to accomplish certain goals or solve problems. And it involves listening, paying attention to people's tone, and to their energy and to their feelings, and recognizing them and the things that are holding them back. It involves short prompts and simple questions that encourage people to reflect, aiming them in the right direction without giving them the answer. Stephanie, who was most recently at Salesforce, said that working on systems, we're task-focused, and that just do-it voice in our head tempts us to knock out those small things that we know we're good at. But when we answer the support calls or support questions on Slack, or we're busting the bugs instead of enabling others on our team to do it, we hold everyone else back from growing, and we have to give people the space to learn from trial and error. When enabling others, it's important to strike that balance between being collaborative without inserting yourself too much. Lauren at Dropbox shared this great coaching technique that she's learned. She said that instead of gatekeeping systems and saying, oh, please don't do that, We can ask teams, help me understand why you're doing that. And if someone is struggling, we can help by saying, I can show you a better way. In design systems, we can also guide through facilitation and creating training materials. Mirko shared that at IBM, he's put together courses around customer experience-led leadership. At IBM, this education is being used to coach senior business leaders, think product managers, general managers, VPs, on understanding what their role is in a human-centered organization. Job number 4, leaders need to create connections. This means building enduring relationships and trusted collaborations with many teams across the business. The best metaphor that I heard for this came from Lauren at Dropbox, and she described herself as a telephone operator, managing channels, connecting people, and through this, she meets teams who create components that other teams can use. She'll help them write down all their learnings about that, and then she'll share those with other teams who can benefit from them. Stephanie told me that herding cats is actually a term of endearment. She said that the best relationships of her life have come from mobilizing the masses. At Salesforce, when a big push would happen across many product surfaces, she would go and tap the shoulders of people on system, product, platform teams. And she described that even in the trenches of that large-scale effort, there's this beautiful sense of camaraderie, watching everyone come together. She said that these bonds were so strong that those people who worked together a decade ago are still in touch to this day. Job number 5, leaderships need to communicate value. Communicating value means that we have to articulate the role and the impact of the design system to many different types of stakeholders. And this includes understanding the economic value of our team, but also the value that we bring to customers. Leaders like Lauren described this as being one of the hardest jobs we have. And the truth is, that's because many great systems go unnoticed. Executives have no idea how much work it is. You can't compare systems to a team like growth or the flagship product. It's the foundation. If the foundational work that we're doing, such as color tokens, lands, success is often measured by the fact that customers don't notice the change. And often, this work has a longer time horizon. So how do we tell that story for the value? Jared mentioned that at Shopify, they tie metrics to systems work that the business actually cares about. So they create component coverage dashboards with this Google Lighthouse view, a contribution dashboard to assess engagement, and a way to track active maintenance. And again, you don't even have to have the fancy dashboards. A spreadsheet works too. At GitHub, Diana wrote newsletters about the work being done in the design org, which the head of the organization read every single week. And the goal was to make the design work more visible and spread that work upwards and sideways and even within the design systems team. In communicating value, having alignment with an executive sponsor or a manager is key to success. Allison at Zendesk said that having someone with a shared understanding who sees the same impact of design systems as you do means that you're not going it alone. And lastly, make sure that you communicate outcomes over outputs. Measuring the amount of components made or the amount of teams using them is not as impactful as telling the stories about the value of the work. For example, did the system increase people's ability to use your website because you introduced new accessible patterns? Did new hires onboard onto their teams with more confidence and deliver higher quality work because we trained them to use the design system? Being able to tell these stories in a way that taps into the emotional and the functional value of the system is more powerful than the numbers by themselves. Last job number 6. Leaders need to grow the business. Design system leaders have to be able to align their outcomes to the business. Growing the business means working closely with people who are setting the vision and the strategy and laddering the goals of the design system up to the company's key objectives. Part of the way that we grow the business is by figuring out how to become a multiplier or a dependency for business success. I once worked at a company focused on international expansion, and working with different business leaders, I was able to align systems work on typography and global language support to that business goal, making the company's expansion efforts dependent on our team's work. Mirko shared with me how he tied their design system at IBM to their push to become a platform ecosystem. and this positioned their system as core to the provider experience for first and third-party offering providers so that they could deliver products to the platform. The easier and faster and cheaper it would be to deliver to the platform, the larger that ecosystem would grow and the more customers that it would attract. There are several different types of audiences who need to understand that relationship between your team's work and the business vision. And the first one is the teams delivering outcomes, and those are the teams who your team is usually collaborating with. The second are the leaders, those people that are coaching and guiding those teams. The third are business executives who make investment decisions. And lastly, there's operational leaders who are creating and transforming conditions within the company. As Allison from Zendesk said, it's also really important to make sure that people on the systems team understand the business strategy and how the work that they're doing fits into the bigger picture. So doing these six jobs well enables design system leaders to demonstrate how the impact of design systems extends far beyond one tool or one library that their team maintains. And as these interviews show, design systems have the ability to transform how the entire organization works together. So let's keep doing these jobs and dispelling the design system myths. Where do you want to take your career next? Are you hoping to pursue a role where you're doing some of these jobs? If so, some of the leaders that I spoke with have some advice for you. Number one, look for where the holes are. If you're able to sell the holes as an actual problem, then you can put yourself in a position to fix them. In order to affect change, think more broadly, not just your team's area, but things that impact all teams. Lindsay described doing research to learn that at the time, most teams at Lyft didn't have the confidence or the ability to confidence in their ability to follow WCAG guidelines or build accessible products. And so she knew that Lyft also had VPATs and compliance requirements that they had to meet. By understanding those gaps and taking that data to leadership in order to fund the initiative, she was able to get more support. And I've heard this from multiple companies who did this with accessibility. First, they got one person, two people, and then they had an entire accessibility team. Second piece of advice from Jules, find a coach. It's really helpful to have outside support and a neutral perspective. Jules at Credit Karma said that this can help you be more proactive and start the right kinds of conversation with your manager. This person could be somebody who's formally trained, but it could also just be starting coaching circles with a peer group of other design system leaders outside of your organization who can also be really effective, which can also be a really effective way to get help and to help others. Don't confuse team size with influence. That's a trap. It's the wrong way to frame growth. Allison from Zendesk shared that growth comes down to impact level and what successes you can point to your team having had a hand in. It's hard to make a big team efficient, but a smaller team can move faster and still have impact. Study how decisions get made and the experience that people have making decisions. At IBM, Mirko says he looks for people who understand decision workflows. How are decisions made? How are they contributed? How are they reused? How are they governed? How are they learned about? Making that workflow easy to do and conducive to outcomes is what he calls system lifecycle work. As many people have echoed at Clarity already, you can't do a cookie-cutter approach to design systems. What works for one company doesn't necessarily work for another. You have to build a system that meets the needs of the team and the company and the product and the scale at that time. Diana at GitHub shared that as a systems leader, you can actually apply that same thinking to organizational design and to leading a team. My advice is that if you're in an organization that struggles to reward design systems leadership and promote systems people into higher levels, don't give up. There are periods in our careers where no matter what you say, there are some people who just won't get systems. Maybe that's because systems require a tolerance for some degree of complexity. And there will be other times where we'll have an incredible set of advocates who not only get systems, but they invest in us and our teams. And there's honestly some peace in knowing that that's an endless cycle. It's not completely in our control as stakeholders come and go throughout the years. So as I wrap up, I'd like to share 3 big ideas that are offered on how to address the issues that design system leaders faced in their journey. The first one comes from Lindsay. She talked about the importance of us having a distinct career path for design systems. A lot of organizations have different scopes of work and responsibilities for product designers, design operations, brand design. In calibration sessions where managers are assessing levels, people working on design systems are often calibrated against their product peers. And this leads to scenarios where, for example, a manager will advocate for a product designer by highlighting the fact that they're doing product thinking that gets 2 or 3 teams aligned on a project that led to moving this key number, and they'll get a lot of nodding heads. Meanwhile, another manager will highlight how the systems designer is doing systems thinking to align 8, 12 teams on multiple projects that led to this quality improvement across all of these features. And yet it's not clear to others why they're operating at a higher level than their peers. When systems people get to senior leadership, they've had to show so much diplomacy, thinking holistically across the entire company, not only about the products, but about what it means to be an engineer or a designer at the company. And they know how each team operates and how to operate with those teams. They're truly someone who's an expert in connecting dots and handling tough situations. Specializing in knowing all these pieces and parts and knowing the end-to-end journeys and knowing how teams work together and making those decisions about all those things is truly the craft and deserves to be valued as much as any other discipline. A second big idea coming from Jules was imagining design systems as its own org within the business. This comes from challenges of positioning a design system. When a design system reports up through a business or a function, other businesses or functions might not think it's for them to use. Instead of having the system report into a chief design officer or a chief technology officer or some VP of a business unit, some imagined organizing the system under a chief operating officer or a chief of staff. The remit of that org might be about operationalizing organizational excellence and delivery. Imagine being that team that exists and lives in all those spaces where people are building and shipping. Maybe we would research scenarios with orgs where we're learning things like, oh, in this situation, teams didn't have enough time, and in this situation, this would be the constraint. And that enables us to ask, well, what would it take for that to not happen again? And let us operationalize a solution to that. What would it be like to have a true design systems org, a design platform org, a design infra org that's truly tackling some of these bridge problems as one org? The third idea that I want to share builds on the last one. Is about design systems for good business. If you believe that design system teams are capable of operationalizing organizational excellence, which I do, then they will first need to work with business leaders to define what organizational excellence is in the first place. Which begs the question, if we spend so much of our time defining what good design is, then maybe we can work with others to define what good business is. This might be one of the biggest opportunities I see. There's currently lots of talk about rethinking the business. For example, the triple bottom line is focused on people, planet, profit. There are many ways making organizations that are more in harmony with the world around them. A business's first instinct is to fit additional dimensions into the framework. In this case, adding people and planet to profit. For example, in our definition of good, we'll say, oh yeah, well, we need to add some sustainability goals to that. But if we do it this way, we're still going to end up with revenue at the top of the requirements hierarchy. We have to understand the organization itself in a bigger context, looking at that business alongside the communities that they operate in, such as regulators who are regulating that business and governments that they're engaging with. There's systems to be designed at that level, and that might reshape the systems that we make within our organization, such as how we make decisions about data and privacy or artificial intelligence and ethics. We're so embedded in these things that we can no longer afford not to think about them. As leaders, we have control over how we apply systems thinking to solve any type of problem within an organization. It can be about making product experiences more cohesive. It can be about helping design and engineering work better together. It can also be about training people in your organization to be better systems thinkers. It can be about making systems that help our customer support teams answer the phone, like my first job at the restaurant or that designer of the customer support website. The sky's the limit. What I hope you've taken away from my talk today is that the bounds of the systems are only where you draw the line for yourself, on your team, and within your organization. So where's the most impact that you can make, inside or outside of the company you work in, with the skills that you have in design systems? If you still think about design systems as specific decisions related to components, then you'll certainly make a difference. But what if we keep going and continue to improve how we make other kinds of decisions? I think we're just tapping the surface of what we're capable of and what companies and users need from systems. And I'm excited to see what more will come from us as our practice both deepens and broadens its reach. We can have leadership without design systems, but we can't have design systems without leaders like you. I want to thank everybody who I spoke with in these interviews. I want to thank the organizers of Clarity, and I want to thank you all for joining and listening to my talk today.
Great. Thank you so much, Hayley. Okay, this has prompted a lot of thoughts. So you spoke to, what, eight different leaders, is it, I think?
Yeah, there are a couple I didn't share up there,
right,
but yes, roughly.
How similar was their paths to becoming design system leaders? All kind of the same or all very different?
Yeah, I think, at least from my conversations, it felt like the commonality across these different leaders was that they all had this intense curiosity for building interdisciplinary skill sets. So they would go and they'd be learning about, okay, I'm a designer and I'm working on this thing, but I don't feel like if I don't understand how it's built, then I don't feel confident in my design decisions. So these were people that were always looking for dependencies, and as a result would, if they were doing design, maybe they would say something like, oh, I need to understand my users better, and so now I need to build research capabilities. And even people that were interested in building skills outside of design and engineering, things like, oh, I'm going to be, as a manager, I'm going to be working with my HR business partner a lot. I need to learn a little bit more about human resources. So that was something that was common across all of them.
So curiosity is the common point.
I think so.
Interesting, because I would have thought maybe it was about that, to use the cliche, getting the seat at the table. Design systems as a way to, like you talked about, speak the language of business and make the case for design.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because almost every person that I talked to, I asked them the same questions, and my last question was, where do you see yourself going, right? What's the next step in your career? And not a single one of them had aspirations for bigger titles or bigger roles. They were just very excited and passionate about helping build these organizations that have these deeper interconnections and these deeper relationships. And so I don't know, I found that to be really interesting, that it was almost like the egoless quality, and that, again, that curiosity seemed to be the driver, not maybe the ambition to have the higher title.
Yeah. Is there a next step? It's not like we've ever formalized a career ladder for design systems, right?
Right. That was something that came up too, and something that I think that, again, we sort of in design systems we're fit into that same kind of leveling for product design and other things like that. That's sort of the ladder that we're usually calibrated against. But as we're thinking about the future, I think that the interesting, at least something that, even Jules mentioned about, having a design systems org, there's a potential there for that ladder to fit into an organization where maybe those people are doing what we're doing, but at higher levels within the organization, not just at that component level or even at that journey system level, but even looking at the values of the company and what we stand for, and actually helping kind of steward and facilitate those conversations with other kind of senior executives.
Yeah, I'm curious about that idea of the design systems org. Like, you're getting kind of the big picture view by talking to all these different people and seeing the commonalities and the differences. Did you see different structures, like a very centralized model versus distributed versus, anarchy? Or did everything kind of turn out similar across all these different organizations?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, the similarities were sort of like the design systems team of one becomes, a single team, and then some teams, as they're growing, kind of start to segment out different areas of the system related to that kind of decision process. So, teams that are focused on, I don't know, the UI and the user experience, and then the tooling and the adoption and things like that. And so you started to see these bigger teams. But I think that even just looking beyond that, looking at kind of like how a systems team grows, what I was interested in, especially talking to like Diana at GitHub, it was like, how did you move from being in design systems to becoming the head of design? And I think that particular story of then understanding how, design works with marketing, works with brand, works with growth, works with product, works with all these, other parts of the org is what really, started to when a designer starts to take on more operational roles beyond design systems, such as maybe they're helping influence a career leveling framework, maybe they're helping lead a customer experience-led training course. Like, they start to, design systems people just naturally tend to start to say, oh, if I can improve this over here, then maybe I can apply some of these things and like think about our transferable skills across the entire org. And that was really inspiring to see Diana's story.
Yeah, I mean, you made a point of emphasizing the connection making.
Yes.
That's one of the parts of the job of being a design system leader, which is great, but I mean, it does make design system leadership sound an awful lot like middle management. Is that fair?
I guess I don't know. I guess I haven't thought about that yet, but I think that design system leadership is more about a lot of people that I spoke with, they were very confused by what other kind of managers do within the organization, such as product managers, for example, because they were talking about how those people were really responsible for working, with just their peers within one team on kind of one core feature offering. And when working with them, they found that it was really hard to have meaningful conversations because they were kind of thinking at this altitude of how that particular product that person
not the
is
bigger
doing,
picture.
Yeah, is not connected to anything else that all these other roadmaps are connected to. And I think design systems leaders have that visibility. And I think once we know, we can't unknow. And so part of the beauty of that is, okay, how do we actually help all? Maybe I would go a higher altitude and say, how do we help all of these middle managers work together? Yeah,
I want to dive into that kind of zoomed out view, seeing the whole picture. It's a very systems thinking approach, right? Understanding how something works by looking at the whole ecosystem. But the perception, I think, of design systems is almost the opposite, which is analytical thinking, which is understanding how something works by breaking it down into its atoms and components and molecules, and this kind of terminology we use. So is there a mismatch between the perception of a design system as small pieces, loosely joined?
Absolutely. I think that's the stereotype. I think that that's almost a stigma in some ways. It's just we're seen as these people that know a lot about one thing. And in fact, I think somebody mentioned it yesterday also as well in terms of the quote from Donella Meadows is like, what we study is the interrelationships between these things. It's not that, yes, we know a lot about these things, but it's actually being more so the people who understand how all of these things work together. And I think just to that point, I just want to highlight too that a lot of what we think of as design systems, I think at least in the domain and the space that we work in tech has been that design systems is specifically in the context of software too, like these components or specific to product. And I think what I'm trying to say is I don't know how we got to that definition that design systems means component library. Design is the intent behind any type of outcome, and systematizing it is just governing those decisions that we're making. And so how do we use that system thinking capability and teach others that capability, or learn from them too, how they're thinking, and use those mindsets as well?
Is it maybe that we're just biased towards what we can see, and we can see the outputs?
Right.
When I look at carbon or material or something, what I can see are the components.
Yes.
So, okay, you could forgive me for thinking the design system is the components. What I'm not seeing is the ecosystem, the system's thinking.
Right. And I think that, to your point, there's an opportunity of making that more visible. And some of the more mature systems that you see are actually starting to do that. I've noticed, for example, at Shopify, there was an effort to, and we heard this yesterday from Spotify too, that, we're moving towards, okay, how do we not just, make components the thing on the front page or of the design system website, but like, how do we show these are the experiences we're designing for: retail, warehousing. These are the users, the pickers and packers in the warehouse, the merchant and the retail, and bring some of that research and the insights that lead to those decisions about those components upstream and available to people, because those kinds of things are also things that they need in order to do their work.
Yeah, for example, the government gov.uk design system always includes the research findings behind, like, why are we using this component? Well, our studies showed here's the reason, which I feel like is quite empowering for the person who's going to use that component. It's not like, use this component, don't ask questions.
Right.
Here's some good reasons tied to an actual user experience to use it.
Yes.
I'm curious, another commonality between all the people you're talking to is their organizations are pretty big, talking pretty large scale. I mean, are design systems, do they only make sense above a certain scale? Like, if you're in a startup, small, it doesn't make sense to have a design system.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that any time you're in a situation where a set of decisions need to be governed, even you in your own work are making systematic decisions, and you may want to write those learnings down for yourself to be able to reference them later. So whether you're a student in college or somebody who is the first designer or the first systems person within your organization, I just think these are practices and behaviors and that's also why I think we're kind of moving that definition of design systems a little bit more from, a specific tool or a specific product to, these practices, because ultimately those are things that I think are, things that you can do at any scale.
At the other end of the scale, let's say, okay, things are going great, you've got a design systems team, design system leader leading it, the organization keeps growing, and at some point, do you need multiple teams? Do you need multiple design systems leaders?
I think some teams or some companies are definitely doing that for sure. And I think that also, I think we learned yesterday there was somebody, I think it's Spotify, you all are talking about the embed model. There's so many different models and programs that you can put in place to make sure that people who are thinking in systems, making systems, can be across different parts of the organization. And I actually think that having a central team who's supporting them, sort of like a design systems program office that's helping these system people, enabling them, is great. But you also, you definitely want to have systems, when you can, if to have them on systems leaders on different teams, because I think that also is how, those are the people in those communities that are trusted for that knowledge, and they are trusted in that area, and so for their domain, whatever it is, security or blockchain or whatever, and so making sure that they are the bridge is something that I do think is really valuable for teams.
Kind of on the, yesterday when Valerie was talking, we were both talking about the reframing things, she talked about underestimated groups rather than underrepresented groups. When I was listening to you describe design system leadership and what's involved, I thought, that sounds a lot like design ops. Mm-hmm. Is design ops just another reframing of this work? Mm-hmm. And is it maybe a better framing if design systems begs the question that the solution somehow involves a design system? Whereas design ops could be broader than that.
Yeah, it's interesting, when I started at IBM, we didn't have design ops, this was a while back when it hadn't really come of age. But as a result, in design, you were the person doing craft work, and you were also operationalizing that work. And so I think in what I've seen as design ops has started to become more defined, I guess you would say, is that it has been more about enabling designers and enabling design leaders. And I think what we are talking about here is enabling interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary work to happen across all business areas, not just sort of specific to enabling design. And that's where I would differentiate the two is, that a lot of operations tend to be function specific, and we want to kind of operationalize at a larger scale.
But when you put it like that, and also thinking about the front of house, back of house stuff, now it sounds a lot like service design.
Yes. I think you're getting warmer, for sure.
Okay, so design ops, service design, yeah, okay, getting there. There's a lot more we could talk about, but I'm afraid we're out of time. We're going to have another break now, and Stephanie Walter will be speaking at 11:20 a.m. That gives you time to go get some coffee, get hydrated. But before you do, please give it up for Hayley Hughes.